I still remember the sound that day by the river boots sinking into wet clay, someone whispering, "Hold on, that's writing." A deputy bent under the shade of a fallen cottonwood and brushed at a piece of canvas hardened by time. The word newspaper surfaced through the mud like a ghost rising from sleep. For a moment, nobody spoke. 17 years of silence broke open in one quiet breath. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Back in the summer of '85, Fremont was the kind of place that seemed sealed off from anything bad. I'd been delivering mail around town for nearly a decade, then peddling my own route before sunrise, same as Daniel. Most mornings smelled of wet grass and bacon grease from kitchen windows. By 6, the air was already warm, low 80s, the sky that washed out blue you only see before the heat sets in. Folks waved without thinking, called each other by first names, left screen doors unlatched. Daniel's family lived in a tan house near the bend of Maple Street. I'd see him sometimes half awake, strapping that canvas bag over his shoulder. His mother would step out in her robe, reminding him to eat something before he left. She had this habit of tucking his hair behind his ear like he was still 5 years old. He'd roll his eyes, but never pull away. Thomas, his dad, left earlier machinist at the mill truck, headlights sweeping across the lawn before fading down the road. They were a steady family, ordinary in the best way. That June, the cornfield stood knee-high and the town moved slow. The biggest excitement was the county fair posters going up near Main Street. Kids rode bikes to the swimming pool, stopping at the gas station for frozen sodas that turned their tongues bright blue. The radio played Springsteen and ads for seed fertilizer. Life had a rhythm we all trusted. Daniel was part of that rhythm. 14, quiet, polite. He'd just started his newspaper route that spring, his first real job. He told me once while waiting at the crosswalk that he was saving for a used radio he'd seen in the hardware store window. "It's got the shortwave channels," he said, eyes bright. "I can listen to ball games from Chicago." I told him to keep at it, that kind of focus would take him places. Every morning, I'd spot his red bike gliding down Birch Avenue tires, whispering over the pavement, the basket packed with crisp rolls of newsprint. You could set your watch by him 5:40 at the corner, 6:10 on Cedar 625 back home. Kids like him were the heartbeat of towns like ours out before dawn, trusted by everyone. That first week of June carried a strange stillness, though I didn't recognize it for what it was. The air felt heavier than usual storms building somewhere west of the river. Dogs barked at odd hours. Even the mill whistles seemed sharper, echoing too long across the fields. Margaret mentioned once while picking up mail that Daniel had been nervous about something said. A car had slowed behind him one morning but kept going. She brushed it off, laughing that he'd been watching too many detective shows. I remember smiling too, but something about the way she said it, half laughing, half frowning, stuck with me later. Our evenings then were simple. Lawn chairs under porch lights, talk of crops and gas prices, kids catching fireflies. Sheriff Hanlon would swing by the diner for pie, teasing me about sorting everyone's gossip before the mailbags. He was young for a sheriff's steady voice eyes that noticed everything. Nothing ever really happened in Fremont beyond a fender bender or a stray cow on the highway. We thought that kind of peace was permanent. On June 11th, the night before everything changed, the town felt washed clean. A brief rain had cooled the sidewalks and the smell of damp earth drifted through the open windows. I remember sitting on my porch with a glass of sweet tea watching lightning flicker far to the south. Daniel coasted by around 8, calling out a quick "Evenin', Mr. Dorsey" as he pedaled toward home. His bike's little headlamp bobbed like a firefly in the dusk. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time I saw him. Margaret told me later that he'd laid out his route map on the kitchen table that night, marking addresses with a blue pen. She'd ironed his red shirt for the next morning, his lucky color, she said. Thomas had checked the tires on the bike, made sure the chain was oiled. They were proud of him, proud of how seriously he took that job. Just after midnight, the crickets quieted as they sometimes do before a storm shift. I woke once to the distant rumble of a freight train crossing the river bridge. The house settled and all was still again. Somewhere down Maple Street, the Whitakers' porch light clicked off. Morning would come, the same as always, sun pushing over the rooftops, sprinklers starting doors opening to the sound of another safe, predictable day. But for reasons none of us could name, that dawn carried a weight in the air, a kind of hush that didn't belong. By 5:30, my coffee was poured, and the radio hummed low in the kitchen. I stepped out to get the morning paper, but the driveway was empty. It wasn't like Daniel to run late. I waited a minute, then two, telling myself he must have started on the far side of town that day. Still, when I looked down Maple Street, I saw Margaret's curtain shift, just a quick flicker, and I knew she was waiting too. The sun crested above the silos, throwing that bright Nebraska light across the lawns, and for a heartbeat, the world looked untouched ordinary. Yet the stillness that followed stayed too long. The birds hesitated to sing. A truck passed, but no red bicycle followed. That was the morning Fremont's peace began to unravel quietly, almost politely, one empty porch at a time. It was just after sunrise when I realized something wasn't right. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the smell of percolated coffee filling the room, listening to the morning news hum faintly from the radio. Normally, by that time, I'd hear the thud of the newspaper hitting my porch. Daniel never missed a delivery. Not once. But that morning the porch stayed bare, and the air outside carried a strange stillness. The sprinkler across the street ticked in its rhythm. Birds chattered in the cottonwoods, and for a few minutes I tried to tell myself maybe he'd started on another route, or maybe his bike had thrown a chain. By 7, Margaret's curtain had moved 3 separate times, a nervous flutter like a heartbeat. I could almost see her pacing behind the glass. When I finally stepped outside, the neighborhood was waking up slow. The smell of cut grass drifted through the air, and a few doors down I saw Thomas pull his truck out of the driveway, one hand tight on the wheel. He waved at me but didn't stop. Something in his expression, set jaw eyes scanning the street, made my stomach sink. Margaret came out soon after robe, pulled clothes, hair still damp from the shower. "He's never late," she said. "He always calls if he's going to be late." I didn't have the heart to tell her there wasn't a payphone anywhere on his route. By 7:30, Thomas was driving slow along the edge of town, retracing the streets Daniel would have taken. A few of us joined him, neighbors who'd known that boy since he was small enough to chase fireflies barefoot down the sidewalk. We split up, scanning the ditches, calling his name into the still air. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, made us stop and listen. Then near the old fence line by the grain silos, someone shouted. It was Mrs. Carter, the same woman who'd waved to Daniel just after dawn. She was pointing toward something by the fence. When I got there, I saw it right away, Daniel's red bicycle standing upright, as if he'd simply stepped off and meant to come right back. The kickstand wasn't even down. It leaned against the wire like someone had placed it, carefully balanced it. The tires were still warm. His canvas delivery bag was missing, but the bike itself looked untouched. No torn grass, no scuff marks. Nothing that said, struggle. Just that bike waiting the morning breeze, turning its handlebar streamers ever so slightly. Thomas didn't speak. He just stood there, staring, hands on his hips, jaw working like he was grinding his molars. Margaret arrived a few minutes later, clutching her house keys so hard they left marks in her palm. "Where's the bag?" she kept asking, looking around as if it might appear in the tall grass. No one could answer her. Sheriff Hanlon arrived soon after, hair still wet from his shower badge pinned crooked on his shirt. He crouched beside the bike, ran a hand over the seat, and looked down the empty road. Then he called for deputies. By noon, the quiet edges of town were crawling with people. Patrol cars, volunteers, kids on bikes weaving between grown men with flashlights and maps. The sheriff's office brought in 2 bloodhounds from Lincoln, and we watched them sniff along the roadside noses to the dirt. They caught a scent, but lost it within a few hundred yards, circling in confusion. The riverbanks were checked, the fields combed. Helicopters swept overhead, blades thumping against the still air. The noise felt out of place, like a storm moving over a church service. By dusk, the search had spread miles beyond where Daniel's route ended. Folks walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, the sun burning low and red behind the silos. Some called his name, others just moved in silence, scanning the ground for a scrap of fabric, a footprint, anything. The sheriff ordered the creeks checked, the barns opened. They found nothing. The only sound that carried that night was the low whine of generators powering floodlights as deputies marked off the field near the fence. Margaret refused to go home. She sat on the tailgate of their truck, a blanket over her shoulders, eyes locked on that empty road. I brought her coffee, though it went cold before she touched it. Around midnight, Thomas told her he'd drive her home, but she just shook her head. "If he comes back," she said softly, "he'll come here." The next morning, the Fremont Daily ran a photo of Daniel, the one from that spring with his shy smile and his delivery bag slung across his chest. Above it, in bold print, "Paperboy missing." I stood in line at the gas station watching people buy copies, shaking their heads like they were trying to make sense of it. That's how small towns react to tragedy. They talk, softly, fill the silence with theory and hope. The noise can hold back the truth. By the end of that week, every telephone pole carried his picture. You couldn't drive a block without seeing that face staring back at you. We searched every barn shed and storm drain twice. Kids stayed indoors. Parents locked doors that had never needed locks. The sheriff kept a command post at the fire station, his desk covered in maps and lists of volunteers. He looked older every day, as if each sunrise added a year to his face. I remember one afternoon standing beside him as we watched a line of searchers sweep across a field of soybeans. "It's like he vanished into the air," he said quietly, almost to himself. I didn't answer. What was there to say? Days turned into weeks, and Fremont began to fold the story into its routine. People still asked, still speculated, but the voices grew softer. The flyers faded corners, curling in the summer heat. The Whitakers stopped coming to church, and the laughter that used to spill from their porch at dinner time was replaced by silence. The house seemed dimmer every time I passed it, as if grief itself had drawn the curtains. By August, the official search ended. The sheriff made the announcement on the courthouse steps, hat in hand. He thanked the volunteers, promised to keep the investigation open. Behind him, Margaret stood rigid, her face pale and expressionless. Thomas kept one arm around her, but even from where I stood, I could see his hand trembling. That night I sat on my porch again, same view, same breeze, but the town felt different. The sound of sprinklers seemed louder, forced. Porch lights stayed on longer, as if people believed illumination alone could keep evil away. When the mail came the next morning, I noticed Daniel's old route had been reassigned to a high school boy from across town. He rode the same streets, same time, same quiet dawn. But every time I heard the whir of his tires, my chest tightened. Fall arrived, then winter. The fields turned gray, the air colder, but Daniel's absence stayed like humidity that never quite lifted. Some nights when fog rolled off the river, I'd wake and think I heard a bicycle chain turning somewhere out there, faint and steady. I'd sit up listening, heart pounding, until the sound faded into nothing. By the next summer, people had stopped talking about it out loud, though the silence that followed his name said plenty. I carried the memory quietly, same as the rest of them. Fremont went back to mowing lawns, hosting bake sales, planning the fair, but a current of unease ran beneath it all, a sense that something unfinished lay just outside the edge of sight. I saw Margaret once at the grocery store, maybe 5 years later. She looked smaller somehow, her hair all gray. She was buying milk and bread, her cart nearly empty. When she recognized me, she smiled, but it was thin and tired. "You still walk your route?" she asked. I nodded. She looked down at her hands for a long moment and whispered, "He'd be 30 now." I didn't know what to say. I just stood there wishing words could fix what time had refused to heal. And then for nearly 2 decades, Daniel's name was only spoken in passing, quietly, respectfully, like saying grace before a meal. Life moved forward as it does. People married, had kids, watched them grow. But some memories, they don't dissolve. They just wait. It was 17 years later, in the summer of 2002, when the river finally decided to speak. The Platte had run low that season, the banks dry enough to walk without sinking. A volunteer cleanup crew had been sent to pull debris, tires, bottles, rusted scrap from under the old bridge. I was there that afternoon helping load trash into pickup beds, the air thick with humidity and mosquitoes. One of the younger men working near a fallen cottonwood called out. He'd found something tangled in the roots, a heavy, mud-caked bundle. At first, we thought it was an old sandbag or feed sack washed downstream by the floods. He tugged at it until it came loose, landing in the muck with a wet slap. When he turned it over, I saw the faint lettering across the front, nearly erased by time but still legible newspaper. We all went quiet. The sound of the river, the insects, even the wind, it all fell away for a moment. He crouched, brushed at the hardened mud, and pried open the flap. Inside were papers, yellowed and fused together, but one headline stood clear through the grime: June 12, 1985. The date burned itself into my mind like a brand. The sheriff's department was called before anyone said another word. They came fast, lights flashing against the water. Deputies sealed the bag in plastic, careful, almost reverent. When I saw the strap hanging from the side frayed canvas, still bearing the faint initials DW, I had to turn away. That night, Fremont glowed again with porch lights, same as it had 17 years earlier. Phones rang, reporters gathered, and the quiet we'd all built around Daniel's memory shattered in a single day. I watched the news in silence, the screen showing deputies carrying the mud-streaked bag toward a cruiser. Above the anchor's voice, the old headline scrolled, "Possible break in 1985, Paperboy case." I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the sound of that strap scraping against the plastic as they lifted it, the way it looked like something that had been waiting to be found. By morning, the town was alive with old names and older fears, and though no one said it outright, we all knew what that discovery meant. Daniel hadn't simply vanished. He'd been taken somewhere we never thought to look. The next days would peel back layers of memory we'd spent years trying to bury. And what the river had returned was only the beginning. The morning after that bag surfaced, Fremont felt like it had been pulled back into a memory. It never escaped. I remember walking down Main Street, seeing the newspaper boxes lined up outside the diner, all carrying the same headline. People stood in small knots, talking low, as if raising their voices might stir something best left sleeping. Sheriff Hanlon held a press conference that afternoon in front of the courthouse. He was older now, gray, in the beard, voice a little rougher. The bag was displayed beside him in a clear case, mud still clinging to the straps, the old Fremont Daily News logo barely visible. He didn't promise answers. He just said, "This is Daniel's bag. We'll start again." I could tell he wanted to believe that starting again meant something different this time. For weeks, that discovery was all anyone talked about. It was as if the town had been wound tight for 17 years, and now every old suspicion came rushing back. People who hadn't spoken about it in a decade started remembering things, half-seen cars, unfamiliar faces, moments that might have meant nothing, but suddenly felt important. I sat with Hanlon one evening in his office, maps spread across the desk, old photos pinned to corkboard. He tapped one with a pencil, the aerial grid from the original search. "We didn't go near that part of the river," he said quietly. "Not once." I knew he was right. Back then, the Platte had been running high. That stretch would have been underwater. Still, the thought that someone had placed the bag there stuck with both of us. When I went home that night, I passed the Whitaker house. The porch light was on again, the same soft glow I remembered from that first morning he went missing. Margaret had aged sharply. I saw her sitting on the porch swing the strap of that bag folded across her lap like a relic. She didn't look up when I stopped on the sidewalk. "It's him," she said softly before I could say a word. "I know it's him." Thomas stood in the doorway, quiet eyes fixed on the street. There was nothing to add. Everyone knew the same truth after all those years. That bag was the only piece of Daniel that had ever come home. The sheriff reopened the investigation in full. Files that had been boxed and stored in the courthouse basement were brought back into daylight. I helped where I could, mostly sorting through witness statements, the old handwritten kind on lined paper. The pages smelled like dust and attic air. One note caught my eye. A woman who claimed she'd seen a rust-colored pickup idling near the field the morning Daniel vanished. Back then, she hadn't been sure enough to swear by it. Now, when Hanlon tracked her down, she was nearly 80 and said she remembered the sound of that truck, clearly a loud, uneven idle, like the engine was choking. Another report mentioned a stranger at the gas station that same week, a traveling salesman who'd checked into the Fremont Motor Lodge but never showed up to pay his final bill. None of it fit neatly, but the sheriff started drawing lines on a map anyway, connecting locations like he could force the truth to reveal itself. I admired his persistence, though deep down I think both of us knew that time had already stolen too much. Then came the public. The internet had just started creeping into small-town life back then, and message boards lit up overnight. People were posting theories, photos, grainy maps. Everyone claimed to know something, or to know someone who did. I remember reading a post from a man who said his father once worked near the Platte and had found odd debris long before the cleanup crew. He couldn't remember what became of it. That was the problem with time. It turned memories into fog, and everyone started seeing ghosts in the mist. Reporters returned in waves. Vans parked along the courthouse square, cameras aimed at the sheriff's office. Fremont hadn't seen that kind of attention since the late 80s. Some of them came to my house, remembering I'd been part of the original search. They asked what I thought, whether I believed Daniel had met with foul play. I told them the truth as I saw it. I believed someone had placed that bag deliberately, and not the boy himself. Beyond that, speculation was just noise. Still, it was hard not to wonder. The bag had been buried deep under the roots of that fallen tree, far enough that floodwater alone couldn't have wedged it there. And the route, it didn't make sense. The river was miles outside Daniel's delivery area. He would never have gone that far before breakfast. So how did it end up there? The sheriff said as much during one of his briefings. This wasn't carried downstream. It was hidden. That single word, hidden, changed everything. It meant intent. It meant someone had touched it after Daniel was already gone. I think that realization shook Margaret more than anything else. She called me a few days later, asked if I remembered whether Daniel ever talked to strangers on his route. He was polite, I said, but cautious. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said he'd have trusted someone he knew. That thought lingered with me. Maybe it wasn't a stranger at all. Maybe the danger had come from somewhere closer, from someone who'd earned his trust over those small, ordinary mornings. I tried not to dwell on it, but once that possibility enters your mind, it doesn't leave. Weeks went by, and the sheriff's office started bringing in the old deputy's men who'd worked the case in '85, now gray-haired and retired. They remembered details the reports didn't capture, the way the bike stood too neatly, the way the tire tracks ended as if someone had lifted it. One of them said something that stuck with me. "He didn't fall," the man said. Tapping the photo of the bicycle, he stopped. The forensics team tested what was left of the papers inside the bag. Most were too degraded to read, but in the ones that survived, they found Daniel's handwriting, small blue circles around addresses on his route, faint but still visible. That discovery made my throat tighten. It was proof that he'd finished at least part of his route that morning, that he'd been alive long enough to mark his progress. Yet there were no fingerprints, no fibers, nothing else that could point to who touched that bag last. The town tried to settle back into itself, but the rhythm never returned. Every conversation, even the casual ones, drifted back to the case. At the diner, people lowered their voices when I walked in, not out of disrespect, but out of habit, like they didn't want to disturb something fragile. A few of the younger folks who'd been children when Daniel disappeared told me the discovery had shaken their own kids. They remembered being warned not to ride alone, not to stray from home after dawn. The unease had been buried so long it had become part of our soil, and now it was surfacing again. Margaret told me once that she couldn't decide whether the bag's discovery was mercy or cruelty. It proves he was real, she said, but it also proves he's gone. I didn't have an answer for her. Neither did Thomas, though I could tell he'd made his peace differently. He said the bag was final proof, the end of the road. Margaret still believed Daniel might have escaped somehow, that maybe he dropped it while running from something. Their marriage bore the weight of that difference. I saw it in the way they sat apart at the press briefings, each holding to their own version of hope. Summer waned into fall, and the search for more evidence slowed. But just when it seemed the river had given up all it had to tell, a hunter stumbled on something that would start it all again. It was late October. Cool air leaves brittle underfoot, the water low and sluggish. The man was tracking deer near the same bend of the river when he saw something bright, half buried in the mud. He thought it was trash at first, maybe a torn shirt caught on a root, but when he pulled it free, he saw the color faded red streaked with dirt. He turned it over and saw fabric seams, what might have been a sleeve. That evening, the sheriff called me to meet him at the site. By the time I arrived, the riverbank was lit by portable lamps, deputies moving slowly, their boots sinking in the mud. The air smelled of wet earth and metal. They'd already cordoned off a section where they found the shirt along with a few other small items, a rusted buckle, a coin blackened by age. The sheriff held the fabric up under the light. It was torn fragile, but the color, I didn't need to be told what it meant. Everyone in Fremont remembered that red shirt. No one said much. The sound of the water and the click of cameras filled the silence. The sheriff told us they couldn't confirm it yet, but the evidence was consistent. I watched him bag the shirt, the buckle, the coin hands steady, but eyes tired. When I drove home that night, the headlights caught the river glinting in the dark, slow and heavy, like it was keeping its secrets close. The next day, the sheriff spoke to the press again, standing under the same courthouse steps. He wouldn't confirm it was Daniel's shirt, but his face gave him away. Behind him, I saw Margaret crumple slightly as Thomas steadied her arm. It felt like the town itself exhaled all at once, the sound of resignation, of something final. But to me, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of another question. If the bag and the shirt had both surfaced near that same stretch of river, what else was buried there, and when had it been placed? The original search had covered that ground thoroughly back in '85. Nothing had been there then, which meant somehow at some point later, someone had come back. That night, as I sat on my porch listening to the distant hum of traffic and the soft hiss of the wind through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't done. The river might have given us pieces, but someone out there still knew how they fit together. And before the season turned again, that someone or something was going to leave us another sign. The air by the river turned colder that week, sharp enough to sting the skin. Deputies worked the mud until dusk every night, their boots sinking deeper with each step. I stood near the tape most evenings, watching them sift through the wet soil under the portable lights. The shirt they'd found red once, now dulled to a rusted hue, had been sealed and sent for analysis. They said it was consistent with what Daniel had worn, but I didn't need forensics to tell me that. I'd seen that color every morning of that summer in '85, glinting between porch lights and sprinklers as he rode by. Now, seeing it laid out under evidence lamps, torn and water-stained, was like seeing a memory unravel in real time. The next morning, the sheriff called a press briefing, this time in the firehouse garage, to avoid the rain. I stood near the back, coffee in hand, watching reporters take notes on damp paper. His tone was careful, every word measured, but his eyes told a different story. "We can't confirm ownership," he said, "but the items found match what we know." Behind him, I caught sight of Margaret and Thomas. She was pale, trembling, clutching her purse with both hands. He stood rigid beside her, lips pressed into a thin line. When the sheriff finished, there was silence. Then a single question from a young reporter. "Does this mean the boy was here all along?" The sheriff didn't answer right away. He just exhaled and said, "We'll keep digging." The phrase hung heavy in the air. For the rest of that week, Fremont moved like it was holding its breath. You could feel the strain at the grocery store and the post office at church. Folks lowered their voices when they spoke of the river as though it might hear them. At night, I'd look out my window and see porch lights burning down every street, the same quiet vigil we'd kept 17 years earlier. Some things never leave you, they just return in a different shape. On the fourth day of the new search, I joined the team near the bend where the hunter had made his discovery. The wind off the water was cold and constant. The deputies had set up screens to sift through the mud, shaking it gently for anything solid. Every few minutes, a clink or scrape would stop the conversation, and everyone would look up, hearts in their throats, until it turned out to be a rock or a bottle cap. By sunset, they'd found a few more scraps, small, unrecognizable fragments that could have been anything, but nothing that answered the questions hanging over us. When darkness fell, we packed up. I was heading back toward my truck when the sheriff caught up to me. "You think he drowned?" he asked quietly. The question sounded less like curiosity and more like confession. I thought for a moment, watching the river curl black under the moonlight. "No," I said finally. "Not that morning. Maybe not even that year." He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the water. The following days brought a kind of cruel rhythm hope, then nothing over and over again. The shirt, the buckle, the coin, each object a breadcrumb leading nowhere. The lab reports came back inconclusive, which somehow felt worse than bad news. Time had done its damage. The soil and water had erased too much. The sheriff told Margaret and Thomas personally. I saw them afterward standing in the courthouse hallway, not speaking. She looked like she was trying to hold herself together through sheer will, while he seemed almost emptied out, as if he'd already grieved this moment long ago. Still, even with no new answers, the discoveries stirred old fears in the rest of us. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about what it meant. About the possibility that someone, maybe someone who'd sat beside us at church or barbecued in our yards, had hidden the truth in plain sight. The rumor mill picked up fast. People remembered every stranger they'd ever seen in town that summer. The drifter at the gas station, the salesman who'd skipped his room bill, even a substitute teacher who left town suddenly the next year. Each story contradicted the next. In small towns, memories blend with myth until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. I tried to stay out of it, but the case kept finding me. A reporter from Omaha called one night wanting an insider perspective. I told him I wasn't interested in speculating, but before hanging up, I asked if he'd ever covered a case where time gave something back without reason. He said no, but that he'd seen plenty where it took everything first. That line stuck with me. As autumn deepened, the sheriff prepared to shut down the search again. "We'll come back in spring," he said, "once the ground softens." It felt like déjà vu, another long winter ahead, the same unanswered questions sealed under frozen soil. But Fremont had changed this time. The story had gone beyond us. Regional news picked it up, then national outlets. Every headline used the same phrase, the paperboy who never came home. One night I sat watching one of those reports, the anchor's voice flat, impersonal. They showed footage from the riverbank, the shirt, the evidence bags, the deputies under floodlights. Then they showed the old photo again, Daniel on his bike that summer. smile frozen in time. I turned the TV off before it ended. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. As winter set in, the river froze at its edges, the same as it had that first year. The sheriff made good on his word to pause the search, promising to resume once the thaw came. Margaret didn't wait for that. She wrote letters to anyone who might listen, the governor, the state patrol, even a few retired detectives from larger cities. I helped her address a few envelopes sitting at her kitchen table one gray afternoon. Her house smelled faintly of lavender and dust. On the mantel, the photo of Daniel in his red shirt was still there, framed beside a small candle. "If I stop asking," she said softly, "it'll be like he never existed." I didn't know how to answer, so I just nodded. When the thaw finally came in early spring, the ground gave way easily. The riverbanks turned slick again, the scent of earth thick and sour. But this time the discovery that followed didn't come from the water. It came from town. The Fremont Daily News building, the same one where Daniel had picked up his papers that morning, was being renovated. The company was moving to a newer office on the other side of Main Street, and crews were pulling up old floorboards to run wiring. One of the electricians found something wedged between the joists, small enough to fit in a hand. A leather coin pouch, brittle and stained initials faintly carved into the flap DW. When the sheriff called me, I was halfway to the river. He asked me to meet him at the paper office instead. I arrived just as the workers were standing in a half circle looking down at a folding table where the pouch sat under a light. The air in that room was cold, heavy with the smell of sawdust and mold. The sheriff didn't say much, just pointed to it. It was right under the basement floor, he said, wedged tight. Inside were a few old coins, nickels, dimes, a penny from '83 and nothing else. Thomas arrived a little later. He took one look at it and said quietly, "That's his." He carried it every day. His voice didn't shake, but his hands did. Margaret followed a few steps behind, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. For a long while, nobody moved. The sheriff finally broke the silence. "If this was his, it means he came back here after his route," he said. That simple statement seemed to change everything. It rewrote the timeline we'd lived with for almost 2 decades. Standing in that basement, the old press machine silent and coated with dust, I tried to picture it. Daniel, just a boy, finishing his route, coming back here for some reason. Maybe to turn in papers, maybe to meet someone. Whatever happened, it started here. That thought made my stomach tighten. Theories flooded the town again, some logical, most desperate. Maybe he'd uncovered something, seen something he shouldn't have. Maybe someone who worked there back then had lured him back. A few names floated around, employees long retired or gone. The sheriff wouldn't comment publicly, but I saw the look in his eyes. He believed the same thing most of us did, that the story of what happened to Daniel didn't start in the field or end in the river. It began in that building right under our noses. When I got home that night, I couldn't bring myself to turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, thinking about all the mornings I'd watched him ride past my porch, the sound of his bike chain clicking in rhythm. I thought about how small moments, trust routine, the simple act of going to work, could open the door to something you never see coming. They say time heals, but I don't think that's true. Time only hides things better. And for all the years between the day he vanished and the day that pouch surfaced, Fremont had been living on borrowed silence. That spring broke it open again. Even now I can still hear the echo of the sheriff's voice in that empty basement. He was here that morning. Those words stay with me. Because if Daniel walked through those doors after finishing his route, then someone else did too. And that person has been walking free ever since. After the pouch was found, Fremont changed in a way that words can't quite capture. The discovery didn't bring peace, not really. It just opened a quieter kind of ache, one we all carried differently. The sheriff kept his promise to keep working the case, but everyone could see the wear in his face. Years of chasing ghosts had left him tired, though he'd never say so out loud. He still stopped by the diner most mornings, sat by the window with his coffee, and stared at the courthouse across the street like the answers might walk through the doors if he waited long enough. For months after investigators combed through every record tied to the newspaper office, they tracked down old employees, looked through payroll ledgers, and found a few names that led nowhere. Some of the men were long dead. Others had moved states away. One, a delivery supervisor, had retired to Arizona years earlier. I remember the sheriff saying, "We're chasing shadows now, Sam." And he was right. Whatever had happened to Daniel that morning had been buried under too many winters, too many floods, too many chances for the truth to slip between fingers. Margaret still refused to give up. She'd drive to the sheriff's office with newspaper clippings in a folder and hand them over as if they were new leads. She wrote to missing persons organizations, mailed letters to talk shows, even called the FBI. They all gave her polite answers, but I think she knew deep down that the search was no longer about finding Daniel. It was about holding on to the idea that he hadn't been forgotten. Thomas handled it differently. He went silent, started fixing things around the house that didn't need fixing. Some mornings I'd see him in the yard raking the same patch of grass over and over. He nodded if I waved, but the man who'd once laughed loud and easy was gone. Grief has a way of sanding a person down until only the necessary parts remain. As for me, I stayed close to them in those last years. Not out of obligation, but because silence is easier when you share it with someone who understands it. Margaret began keeping Daniel's coin pouch on a shelf in the living room beside his photograph. Every now and then she'd polish it with a soft cloth, careful not to damage the initials carved into the flap. She said the pouch was proof he'd been here, that he'd left his mark on this town in more ways than one. I used to think it was just her way of keeping busy, but the older I get, the more I see the wisdom in it. Sometimes you have to tend to what little the world gives back. The years went on. Fremont rebuilt itself in small, practical ways. The old newspaper building was sold and turned into an antique shop. The owners left one corner of the basement untouched, a small section of the original flooring covered now with glass where the pouch had been found. They put up a simple plaque in memory of Daniel Whitaker, 1971 to 1985. Still delivering light. It's understated the way this town prefers to remember. People still stop by to leave flowers, mostly around June. I go there once a year myself, usually early in the morning when it's quiet, and just stand there for a while. The sheriff retired not long after the renovation. He moved out to the edge of town close to the river, though he joked he wouldn't go near the water. Before he left, he gave me a box of old case files. "You were there from the start," he said. "Maybe you'll make sense of it someday." I still have that box. Sometimes I open it just to look at the pages. The ink faded, the paper yellowed at the edges. They smell of time and dust. I don't expect to find anything new in there, but there's something about holding the past in your hands that keeps it from fading completely. The older folks in town still talk about Daniel now and then, but only when the river runs low or another storm brings up debris along the banks. They'll say, "You remember the boy with the red bicycle?" And everyone will nod, even those too young to remember the summer he vanished. That's how memory survives here, not through headlines or awards, but through the quiet agreement that some names should never be spoken like they're ordinary. I saw Margaret for the last time a few years back. She was sitting in her yard, the afternoon sun falling through the trees. We talked for a while about nothing in particular, weather, the church bazaar, how the corn looked that year. Before I left, she said, "You know, Sam, I used to think I wanted answers, but I think what I really wanted was for people to remember he was loved." That line stayed with me. When she passed, Thomas buried her beside an empty space marked with Daniel's name. He followed a year later. The stone reads, "Together at last." Some might call that wishful, but I call it faith, the quiet kind that doesn't ask for proof. These days, I still walk the same route I did when I was a mail carrier. though my knees remind me not to rush. The streets haven't changed much. The houses have fresh paint, new mailboxes, but if you close your eyes, you can still hear the faint rattle of a bicycle chain in the morning air. The new paperboys, well, paper carriers now, boys and girls both. They don't know the whole story. Most of them weren't born when it happened. But I like to think the town protects them in its own way. Neighbors keep an eye out. Parents walk the first block with their kids. Fremont learned something the hard way, and it hasn't forgotten. Every so often the river gives up another fragment, a buckle, a button, something small that sends a ripple through town. The sheriff's successor logs them, tests them, and stores them away. Nothing has ever tied back definitively to Daniel, but I suppose that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that people still care enough to look. The river might keep its secrets, but it also keeps our attention. When I look back now, what stands out isn't the mystery itself, but the spaces it left behind, the porch lights that stayed on too long, the flyers that fluttered on telephone poles until they fell apart, the silence that followed when we finally stopped searching out loud. Those things say more about us than about whoever took Daniel. They tell the story of how a town learns to live with what it can't fix. I've had years to think about justice and what it means. Sometimes justice isn't an arrest or a confession. Sometimes it's the persistence of memory, the way a community refuses to let a boy's name be buried under time. Fremont didn't get the ending it wanted, but it got something maybe more important, a lesson in how to remember without breaking. When I pass by the old fence at the edge of town, the one where his bicycle was found, I still stop. The wood is weathered now, half covered in ivy. There's no marker, no sign of what happened there, but if you stand still, you can almost hear the morning of June 12th, 1985, the sprinkler ticking, the faint hum of tires on pavement, the rustle of newspaper in a basket. Then it's gone, like breath on glass. I used to wonder why the past feels louder in certain places, why some stories cling to the air, no matter how many years pass. Maybe it's because they're unfinished, or maybe because they remind us what it costs to take safety for granted. I don't know if we'll ever know who took Daniel or why. But I do know this: every year when the river runs low and the mud cracks open, Fremont looks a little closer at what's underneath. And maybe that's the point, that we keep looking even when we know the answers might never come. If you've ever walked through a quiet place and felt a story still hanging in the air, let me know where you're listening from. Every voice helps keep their memory alive.